Hello, hello, hello. Hopefully, you guys have gotten your drinks and snacks and popcorn. Our next clinician is all the way from Elliott Lake, Ontario. His name is Clark Kooning. He is MMR, who is an honorary member of the NMRA and who ran the Modeling with the Masters. Take it away, Clark.
Well, thank you, and welcome to the world on this great occasion. And thanks to Gordy for putting this together. First of all, for those who don't know me, this is me. I've been past president of the NMRA. As Jordan just mentioned, I've managed and developed the NMRA Modeling with the Masters program. I was also the past president, and you can see some other things that I've done in the past. I've been also past host of Train Masters TV, and I'm sometimes available on the Model Rail Radio podcasts. Currently, I'm modeling a new HO layout, but I have lots of T-track modules. I love N-scale. I have an ON30 demonstration layout and an HON3 layout that I take to shows. And I live in Elliott Lake, Ontario, and I'm a retired paramedic that worked in the Toronto area. And to all those out there who are first line medical people and considered first line on the defense for COVID, I salute you. And where is Elliott Lake, Ontario? Well, it's way up here. We live... I used to live in the Toronto area. When I retired, I moved up to Elliott Lake for the fishing and for the long winters so I can model. We're about a 10-hour drive from Chicago. We're about 6-hour drive from Toronto. And if you know where Detroit is, we're about an 8-hour drive from there. From Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, or Sault, Ontario, or Sudbury, Ontario, we're about a 2.5-hour drive. It's a little community. There's about 10,000 people. And believe it or not, there's about 15 model railroaders. So this is an introduction to model railroading. When I do this seminar, I've done it at night school courses and so forth. And it's really an overall just touching on some of the basics. So if you're new to the hobby, you might want to listen. If you're well experienced, and are building very large layouts, this is maybe all past you. So you could go put up your feet, grab a snack, and maybe come back maybe in the last half because you'll maybe like the scenery section. Okay. So as I said, this is a quick overview of the main topics. It's kind of a dry, boring subject, and especially when it's not done live, you don't have that crowd yelling back and forth at you. So what are the general topics come out around? Well, basically there's 6 topics. There's track planning, bench work, track laying, wiring, and scenery, and then locals and rolling stock. I don't know if wherever you live in the world, if you get the Red Green show, but he said in one of his shows, I once took engineering, but I didn't take all of it. And that applies to model railroading so well. You have to be a little bit of a woodworker to build the bench work. You have to be a little bit of an electrician to wire things. You have to be a little bit of a geologist to do scenery. So it just kind of really sets in, and Red Green is a terrific guy. So track planning. Let's start off with that first. First of all, what's your interest in building a model railroad? If you get a piece of paper, if you're new to the hobby, you may want to jot some of these down. If you've been in the hobby for a while, you may still want to jot this down. So are you a builder? Does building the buildings and the cars interest you? Is that your primary interest? Or are you a rail fan? Do you like to watch the trains run through the scenery and your layout, and that's what your interest is? Or are you more interested in maybe just having a switching layout, such as a lot of the people do in Britain and Australia? They have these fantastic show layouts that are basically switching layouts. They're fantastic. Or are you into operations where you're driving or promoting prototype operations on your railroad? So what is your interest in model railroading? Write that down. In a layout area, what you're looking for is one, a comfortable area. You want a nice, clean, dry area that's comfortable when you're building a layout. You don't want to be, standing in maybe an inch of water in the basement. That's no fun, and it's not safe. But you want a comfortable area for the basement or for the layout. When your kids have moved out and you're retired and you got a spare bedroom, hey, that's a great spot. So think about where the layout is going when you start to develop your track planning for your model railroad. Lighting is a big thing. I've gone to layouts where you walk in and the guy says, "Here's my layout," and he's got a 40-watt light bulb above it. You want to put in some really nice lighting. It doesn't have to be expensive. You don't have to spend a lot of money on it, but go and buy a shop light and have half decent lighting. The backdrop, where's the layout going to go? Is it going to be kind of an island thing that you don't have to worry about the backdrop, or is it going to be pushed up against the wall? If it's going to be on the wall, just putting a coat of paint on the wall really brightens up your possibilities for the layout. So think about all those things. You want to make it a really comfortable area that you want to spend time in. Now, the conventional practice to designing a track or a track plan is to first design your track plan. And that's great if you have a large space, but most of us have a limited space. And therefore, figure out your space limitations, put a track plan together that fits those limitations, and then build the bench work with those limitations and so forth in mind. So you have to design sort of the track plan and the bench work that's dedicated by your space. Okay. And you want to adapt any bench work to your track plan if you're going to have valleys or rises. The best track planning suggestion I can give to any skilled modeler is develop a set of standards for your railroad and stick to them. A lot of custom layout builders will send you a little questionnaire and you fill that out, and that gives them an idea of what you're looking for in a railroad. Well, we can do that too. And you want to develop that standard for your railroad. I do this for every railroad I've ever built, and I find it really helps me stay on track for building a half decent railroad. Okay, space allotted for your railroad can dictate your standards. So if you have a very small space and that's all the space you can use, then those limitations are going to dictate maybe your standards, such as your radius and curves and even frog sizes for turnouts. Compromise is the name of this game. It's like buying a boat. If you ever bought a boat, you buy an 18-footer and you say, "Oh, I should have had the 20-footer." And then you get 2-foot-itis, "Oh, I should have had the 22-footer." And, model railroading is much like that. "Oh, I wish I would have gone that extra 4 feet," or "I wish I had a different room." It doesn't work all the time. It's compromise is the name of the game. So everybody probably knows what gauge is. Standard gauge is 4 foot 8.5. Anything smaller than standard gauge is considered narrow gauge. If you're not familiar with narrow gauge, such as an example is S means S scale, N is for the narrow, and the 3 stands for the 3-foot gauge. So when you see that designation, if you're not familiar with it, you now know what it is. Don't be afraid to go into narrow gauge. There are some fantastic narrow gauge equipment out there that just runs beautifully, whether it be an ON3, ON30, or HON3. So if you're brand new to the hobby, I suggest you build a project layout to start. And the reason why I say that is when you first get into the hobby, you're building layouts, or you think, "I'm going to build this huge layout," but you really don't understand the relationship of the sizes of track and HO scale, if you're doing HO or N scale, to such as things as scenery, such as things as buildings. And by doing a small project layout, you can really hone those little skills. And most modelers in their lifetime build about 5 to 7, what I'm going to say is real railroads, or that's kind of a lousy term, but rather than, you might have a small setup that you're just engaging in to keep busy because you don't have the space. I'm not talking about that kind of layout. I'm talking one that you're really serious at and you're going to build a layout. About 5 to 7 layouts in a lifetime. And by the time you get to that end of the layouts, you've gained a lot of skills and you know what you want, and it becomes just a lot easier design track plans and so forth. Thing they want to use is you want to use the largest space available to you. Now, unless it's your first layout, again, you want to go back to sort of little project layout. But if it's maybe your second or third layout and you want to go, take as much space as available to you. Now, don't get too crazy because it's a lot of work building model railroad. What you see in Model Railroader magazine and Craftsman and all these other magazines, they do not come in a moment. They take years to work on in order to produce that kind of quality and size. Don't think of 4x8 spaces. Everybody thinks of a piece of plywood, and that's going to be the size. Don't think in 4x8 spaces. You can think about going around the wall, shelf layouts. You can have islands. You can have all kinds of different things, but don't think in a 4x8 sheet size. Things they have to consider is the reach for you. What scenery are you going to do? Are you going to have mountainous? You're going to have a prairie scene. And what I mean by type, are you going to do an urban type of railroad? You're going to do more of a country type of railroad? What's your interest? Okay. Table height we'll talk about a little bit later. That's a full discussion in itself. Developing general standards. Well, again, get that piece of paper out. We're going to talk about scale, era, class, motor power, freight cars, and passenger cars. So I think everybody pretty well knows, especially if you've been in the hobby a little bit. And the scale is 1 to 160, HL, and so forth. So, look at different scales. There's no, I'm a prime example. I'm in multiple scales because I like doing different things in those different scales. So era. Now you want to mark this on your sheet, on your standard sheet. What am I doing in the era? It's the time period of your layout. Are you doing sort of the 50s? Are you doing the 60s with early diesels? Are you doing today's railroading with huge locomotives and large cars? So what's your interest? Write that down. Railroad class. A class 1 railroad is like the Canadian National, the BNSF, the Union Pacific, Canadian Pacific. Those are big railroads. They have usually transcontinental railroads. A class 2, now BC Rail has been chewed up by a bigger railroad, but they were kind of a regional railroad. They brought a lot of coal and stuff and potash out of the BC and Alberta area of Canada, and they were what I would call a class 2 railroad. And then a real small railroad, such as in sort of middle of Ontario, there's a little railroad called the Orangeville and Barrie. It's kind of a very small railroad. I think they have like 1 or 2 engines, and they work a very small piece of track. So that would be considered a class 3 railroad. Motor power. What incites you about motor power? What do you want to run? Do you want to run some large or small steam? Do you want to do small diesels or today's large units? Write that down. That's your interest. That should all become part of your standard. Rolling stock. If you're going to go to earlier years, you have only 40-foot cars. Maybe you don't want to run passengers. Or maybe you want to run today's modern equipment with the big auto racks and full-length passenger cars. That takes up a lot more space. But write that down. That's your wish list or your standard. That's what you want in a model railroad. So one of the things that I sort of heard about and then developed myself was how to set a radius. And I don't mean by, drawing it out. I mean, what radius do I need for a car? The simplest method I can tell you about is measure a car. So let's say an HO, a 40 footer, it's roughly about 6 inches in length. Multiply it by 3, it's 18 inches. Now, for those in Europe and people who use the metric language, I'm sorry I didn't put metric in here for you. So it's 18 inches. So the smallest radius, and it will look reasonably well for a 40-foot car, is an 18-inch minimum radius. Now, that said, if you go to a modern auto rack, which is 90 feet long, or if you measure it, 13 inches, it requires 13 times 3 is 39-inch minimum radius. That's huge. So that tells you, if you, in your wish list or your standard, you want to run these big cars, you need big radiuses. So that all focuses in on your standard. Okay? If there's any questions, we'll hopefully get to it by the end. When planning any layout, consider the following. Grades are a very important factor. Location and type of your layout that you're planning is important. You gotta leave room for scenery and buildings. I have seen lots of guys who build layouts and they put tracks so close together and they go, oh, how am I going to put scenery in there? The only thing I can put in is retaining walls. You have to leave room for scenery and buildings. They just take up space. And again, the height of the layout can be important, and we'll talk about that. Grades or inclines. The grade should be a reasonable angle so you can run your longest train without adjusting the power in order to make the grade. Now, with DCC, you sort of have, like we do on cars with speed controllers, but still, you don't want to put it on such a grade that you have to crank up the power to get it over you. Especially on layouts, when you're working on a layout, you want to put the train out there, it circles the layout. You won't have to be watching that, oh, it's going to get stuck on that hill or grade because it's too high. You can calculate the grade, so 100 inches in length. If you have 2-inch of rise, you'd have a 2% grade. It's pretty simple. You want to kind of stick around the 2%. That's kind of the magic number. Now, on small layouts, sometimes you have to go to 2.5 or 3%, especially if you want to cross over another track. Okay, but that becomes, again, maybe smaller trains and so forth to make that happen. So you have to watch that grade in small railroads. So, well, after all, we've written down all these things. Now we have that standard. So my interest, and I kind of did this a little bit, I'm a combination of a builder and rail fan with some operations. I got to have a continuous run. So when I'm working on the railroad, the trains can just run. I love building structures and cars. And I do like operations to a certain limit. I don't do it every day, but maybe once a month. I really enjoy it. So whatever you're interested in, write that down as your standard. Now, space, I just picked an arbitrary space of 5 by 10 roughly. And now in that space that you're going to put it in, make a little note. Is there a water tank? Is there an electrical box? Or is there entry doors that may become a problem in building the layout in that particular area? You can get around all those by doing some interesting bench work, but write those down so you remember that when you start looking at track plans. So in an era, I picked 1960 to 70. So we're talking, basic diesels. You could add some steam, but basically in this case, I'm just going to use some early diesels. Class of railroad, it's a small regional carrier. I'm not really looking after, the Canadian Pacific Railway or the BNSF. So I don't need that many locomotives on a small railroad. And I'm going to go with early diesels such as RS3s or GP9s. And I'm going to try and stick to the 4-axle equipment. Rolling stock in this particular case, 40-foot cars, no passenger cars. So I don't have those big pieces of equipment, which I have to worry about radius, etc. So those cars and those equipment have kind of dictated some of the track standards. So I've gone to no greater than a 2% grade. Now track, we're going to talk, I'm using code 83 flex track for this example. You could go to code 70, or you could go hand laid in code 70, or whatever you want to do. I'm just using code 83 flex. Now turnouts, I think pretty well everybody knows. If you're a true beginner, you may not know this, but turnouts have a number assigned to them. The smaller the number, the sharper the radius. So I want to have nothing more or nothing smaller than a number 6 frog angle in my standard, and no smaller radius than 28 inch. What you said, Clark, we're going to use 40-foot cars. Shouldn't it be 18? Well, those locomotives, same rule applies. I measured the locomotive. It's 9 inches times 3 is 27. I added an extra inch just to make it even, 28 inches. So parallel tracks, the main is going to be 2, in the yards 2.5 or 2 1/4. And the nice thing about spacing them out like that is if you got to put your fingers in between those cars, you have a little extra room. With 2-inch spacing, you tend to knock them all off, and it's like dominoes. So curved track spacing, 2.5 to 3, but check out your NMRA guidelines on the NMRA webpage. And this is a good thing to join NMRA and support all the work that's been done in standards. But all that information is available on the NMRA webpage. The most important thing in planning a railroad is length. A train is a linear piece of equipment. So length is your most important component in a model railroad. Width is only good to you when you turn a train around or you change direction. All right. So, if you have, say, 2 towns on a small railroad and the locomotive is in one town and the caboose is in the other, it's not very realistic. So you need that link to separate the railroad. I always say start with a published track plan when you're new, and cut and paste different ideas from other track plans. So if you like a yard, you like the plan of a yard, take that. Use the main line from maybe your original published track plan, add that in, and you can cut and paste to suit your needs. And that works out really well. And there's a reason why starting with a published track plan. Those are usually pretty well designed and done by guys who know what they're doing. And so it avoids the pitfalls that we fall into by trying to design your own railroad when you're new to the hobby. And you'll learn this as you go through. Okay. Refer to your standards to ensure you get the plan that will meet your needs. So you've got a written agenda or a standard. Use that to dictate where you're going to go with track planning. So my own personal rules, this doesn't mean it's right, it's just my own thing. I use no more than 1.8% grades. Minimum is number 6 turnouts. I like a layout that's at 52 inches off the floor. Because I'm using DCC, I like to walk around with the layout. Now, I know there's many senior modelers who are not able to stand. You may need it at sitting height, and that's fine. You have to adjust that height to your own personal likings. Reasonable size. I really like narrow with long possible runs. A shelf layout to me is really works for me. And you can certainly have islands, but you get long runs with a shelf layout. You also can work in big radiuses. Combination of simple operation with continuous runs, that's my type of railroad. But that may not be yours. That's why you develop that standard. don't be afraid to change your wishes. So maybe you want to go to bigger cars, or you want to go change your era. Maybe you want to do more steam. Change your space. Now that one's a hard one because a lot of times we're only, your space is dictated to you by the boss. So change your equipment standards. So maybe again you want to go to maybe even narrow gauge stuff. Change your scale. You know, if you're a real builder and you're interested in switching, why don't you go to O scale? You can build beautiful cars and buildings in O scale and have a terrific switching layout, and you got the heft of O scale. Or the verse, if you're a rail fan, why don't you go to N scale and have nice, beautiful, long trains running through fantastic scenery? Oh man, that's a rail fanner's delight. All right, well, we're going to want a basic bench work now. I'm going to go through this real quick. I don't think I have to spend a lot of time on this. You know, some of the good tools you need: a table saw, or circular saw, jigless, cordless screwdrivers. One is not good enough. You need about 3 or 4 clamps, measuring tape, you know, the usual stuff. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. Clamps. I cannot tell you how many clamps you will need, especially if you're working by yourself. They're super to have a lot of. The other thing that I used on my newest railroad was a battery-powered nail gun, like a finishing gun. And that really, really was an advantage in building the railroad. Don't forget safety goggles. Don't forget, know your 911 number. Hopefully you won't call. The bench work, there's lots of bench work on how to books and articles on how to build bench work. I'd advise you to read a couple of them, get a few different ideas, and build the bench work to suit your space and your track plan. Now, again, as I talked about, when you're first building one, if you're really limited in space, I don't actually build the bench work, but I kind of have it in mind against the track plan, if that makes sense. Okay. So I come up with the track plan, but I'm building the bench work to match that track plan against the space that I have. Most people, you know, they start off with a tabletop and it's just a flat piece of plywood, usually supported by some kind of framework. It's really fast. It's easy. But the cons to that, it's flat. Poor scenery. You get a rigid shape and you really have limited to a layout form. It's kind of usually a square. Cookie cutter. This is really an easy method for the novice person. You basically draw the track plan out, add about an inch off either side, cut the track or cut the plywood or whatever you're using it for sub row bed. Use risers and lift it up. It works terrific and fairly easy to do. All right, good scenery possibilities. It's easy. Creating grades is easy. It's strong, but sometimes you got to build below the table in some instances, and that can be a problem. It can be kind of restrictive in a layout that you don't have a lot of flow, or it becomes a square again, and it's impossible to change any track work because you've already cut the wood to fit the track work.
All right, Clark.
Yep.
I was going to let you know that it's 30 minutes till.
Perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So, L girder bench work, that's, you know, pretty well everybody use it, or a variation on that when we're building big layouts. Table height. Now, this is a whole discussion in itself. If you look on a lot of the forums, how should I build my table? I like chest height because I want to see the scenery and the structures that are more realistic appearance. I don't want to be looking down in a helicopter on them. But you don't want it too high that it's uncomfortable to work on the railroad. And a lot of people say, oh, I've got grandchildren or I've got kids or stuff, and I'm building the layout only 3 feet high. Well, in about a year and a half, they're going to be, you know, 1.5 feet higher. And you're going to be going, oh, man, my back is killing me because I got to work on this layout. The best advice I can do is build it for you. All right? Because things change. Track work. The difference between a static layout and an operating model railroad. there's two components for that in laying track. You got sub row bag, usually cork. If you're hand laying homozote, I like homozote. And there's other materials out there. Now, track and turnouts, you should only use nickel silver. There's a lot of brass stuff still out there, but it just oxidizes so fast. I would suggest just for the first time, stick to nickel silver. There's all-in-one track. The road bed is built in, like Cotto and Bachmann Easy Track. That's one. If you're a real beginner, that's not a bad way to go. If you're doing T-track modules, you use the Cotto track, and that stuff is bulletproof and it works beautifully for T-track. Sectional track isn't my favorite. I would probably go jump right to flex track, which is usually in 3-foot sections, and you can flex that around to what any design you need. And then, of course, there's hand laying track, but that you can do that a little bit later on. Things to consider in track, rail code size. A lot of people, when they're new to the hobby, hear all these codes, code 100, code 83, code 70. What the heck is that? It's generally the height of the rail in thousandths of an inch, and you just adjust that. Most people use 83. In years previous, in HO, code 70 was the big code. In N scale, it's code 80 for the most part, but a lot of people have been going to code 55 in N scale. There's a few crazies who use code 40, but that's like wire. Turnout size, again, you want to learn maybe a little bit about frog angles and turnout sizes. And then what are you going to do? You're going to use mechanical or manual turnout operation for tortoise switch machines versus a manual throw, say. So those are things to consider as you go. So take your time when you're laying track. Ensure smooth joints. Think about the transition between curves and tangent tracks. Use an NMRA track gauge to check your track. Ready to run track is not engaged a lot of times. You have to check it. And the worst thing you can do is as you're building this, you got a hammer in your hand, you throw it up on top of the layout. What do? You hit the track, it can put it out of gauge. So use your NMRA track gauge all the time to ensure the proper gauge of your track work. And check and adjust all turnouts. Turnouts, again, are not ready to run. Check them with an NMRA gauge. Again, biggest problem that you see, especially like with the all-in-one road bed, you slap them together and you think it's in. The rail joiner is below and the rail is sitting on top. So make sure that's in. Whenever you're cutting track, I use usually a Xuron cutter. But cut the rail square or on a slight backward angle, use a file. Use a file to clean it up. This isn't just cut it and slap it in. You got to take your time. You got to make sure that your track work is really, really smooth. I try and use new rail joiners all the time on when I'm putting the rail together. So let's say if I've taken a rail apart and I've made some modification, I will put new rail joiners on. It just ensures that it's nice and tight. And electrically, it seems to work better, and so forth. When you're laying your track on a curve, do 2 or 3 lengths in a straight line and solder them in place, or solder the joints, and then curve them. That will prevent you from getting that kink in at the joints. Remember, there is no good enough when track laying. You really got to take your time. Basics of electrical wiring. Now, I'm going to really skip through this because I hope people have been sold on DCC. In the previous duns, we used to use common rail or 2-rail wiring and then DCC, of course. Now, for the most part, everybody knows basically the rail is like 2 wires. You're attaching the power supply to the rail. Electricity travels up to the pickup wheels, goes through the motor, makes it turn, comes out on the other pickup wheels, and sort of returns to the power pack. And I'm making it very simple, but and that's what drives the motor. So common rail wiring, that's where you have one wire that goes maybe between 2 power packs, and you've got a common one rail is say plus, and the other one is the 2 negatives that would go to the block switches. It's a very poor method. Don't even go there. 2 rail wiring. Most people, we do that even for DCC. And it allows for numerous power supplies and also easy to find electrical shorts, because if you have a problem, you just disconnect those two wires from whatever it is, you can narrow down your problem. So conventional block control, you'd have a power pack for each locomotive with gaps in the middle or gaps in the blocks, and you'd run that train back and forth. This is analog, of course, and you're really controlling the track polarity to get it to go backwards and forwards. You know, you got to have cab control, you got to have all these blocks and double throw switches, and they cost about $4 or $5 a piece, because people always say, well, how much is it to get into DCC? It's way too much. No, it's not. When you look at adding up two half decent analog power packs at maybe $60, $70 a piece, and then probably 10 double pull, double throws, probably about $3 or $4 a piece, $5 maybe at most, you're looking at almost $200 for that. You can buy DCC beginners sets for easily that price. And what is DCC? For most of us who have been in the hobby, we understand it. But for those who are just new to it, it basically sends out a signal across the rail. There is a little electronic chip called a decoder in each locomotive, and it's like an address. So when the mailman delivers the mail, he finds your address and he delivers it. Same thing with DCC. You're going to get a message sent by your throttle to that locomotive. That locomotive goes, hey, that's my address. I'm going to make my movements based on what the command base has told me. Very simple. So you can run, you know, all these locomotives in any direction without any complicated wire. Now, this was an old one, old slide where it says no decoder. I won't put any no decoder locomotives on any DCC. It just is not worth it. Introductory systems, there's all kinds of systems out there. I really think the great beginner system is an NCE power cab. It's kind of my favorite, especially for people who really are getting into it. A simple, very easy to use unit. Okay, so now you got your wiring, you got your track plan, it's all running, and you're really happy. Spend about a good 4 to 6 weeks running trains, fixing any bugaboos in the electrical wiring, fixing any track plans before you start getting into scenery. Once you do scenery, you're kind of locking everything in place. It makes it a lot harder to fix electrical problems. It makes it a lot harder to move track around. So get all that out. When you're really happy with the way it runs, the fun part starts: scenery. This was a scene on my SN3 layout in my old home. When you walked in the door, this is what you saw. That trestle is about 34 inches long, and that sort of mountain was about a foot short of the ceiling. And again, that bridge was probably about 54 inches in height off the floor. That's all hydrocal and Woodland Scenes ground foam. So you kind of need to know a little bit about your geographical forms. So you want to look at that. But basically, I like to use hydrocal. I don't use Sculptamold. I don't use anything else but hydrocal. For me personally, it works the best. It's very hard, and it takes stains terrific. It really, I can work those colors into the rock without any problems, and it just looks good for me. I use basically cardboard strips with a hot glue gun to build up the landforms, brown and white industrial papers, paper mache. I like to use a real trick that I like to use is the old paint tray with disposable inserts. So I mix up the pancake mixture. I have the slop in the plaster in the bottom of the tray. I dip my paper towel. I run it up the back of the tray. It kind of pulls off the excess, and I can throw that on the the basic cardboard strips and land things. Now I like to use wet molds for the rock formations because I like to form the rock around the base form. So if there's a bit of a curve in the form, that rock will follow that curve. A lot of people just leave them flat and then kind of glue them on. I think it doesn't look as good because it's not following the contours that you spent some time working up in your land formations. Use the same rock types. I've seen some guys who buy rock molds or do some other things, and it's totally different rock types, and they've got them next to each other. It just doesn't quite look right. There are certainly in up here in Northern Ontario, or on the Canadian Shield, we have a lot of rock, and you will see different types of rocks, but usually there's a little bit of separation. So that scene started off as nothing. Here's the track going in, and I've got ties on top of the homozote. I use spline for the road bed, and basically I'm just starting to formulate the track work here. Once the track work was kind of in, I used just basic cardboard boxes. I cut them out with a knife and used a hot glue gun to get me my rough landform. And then I took a bunch of cardboard strips. So you can see the track is all laid. This was all hand laid. I got all the cardboard strips. I just hot glued it into the forms I wanted. And then
Hello, Clark.
Yep.
Just letting you know, about 20 minutes.
Oh, perfect. Then we slapped on the paper mache and the plaster, and it looked like that. It kind of looked like I left one of the kids right in the middle as a piece of hydrocal, but I didn't. And then after applying the rock molds and painting them, get some ground foam on, the bridge was reinstalled. That's kind of what it looked like. Here's another picture with some of the lighting off of it, just to give you some different shadows. And a train going across the bridge. And there's nothing photoshopped. That was just a shot taken as the train came around the corner. Here's another scene. Same thing. It's got a river, not much happening, a trestle bridge. And we're going to turn it into this. And you can see the river below. How do we do that? Well, after, again, we've done the cardboard shell and we've got the basic paper mache on, and I've applied the rocks molds, I start to paint them. And I use the Woodland Scenics earth colors. I pour them in, or put a few drops into one of these plastic cups, and then I thin it out with water, and I want it fairly thin. You can always add. It's very hard to take away. And those are the basic colors I used. The raw umber, the yellow, the stone gray is a predominant, and burnt umber. The black I hardly ever use so little of it, just at the very end to bring out some of the crevices. Now here I am working on this where the bridge was. Now one of the things that I do, a lot of people like to put like one complete color over it first. I don't. I will go in with gray, and so like in here, if you see my pointer, you can come in here and I'll do that gray, and then I'll come up here and I'll highlight that in maybe a burnt umber, a very thin burnt umber. And then, or down here, burnt umber. And then I will take my slate gray and I'll put a couple drops of that burnt umber in and very thinly wash it. And then you kind of get this transitional piece. Whatever the first stain goes on that hydrocal first is going to be the predominant color. So if you come over it with, let's say, the brown or something, it really won't change that dark gray color a lot. It will a little bit, but not much. That first color applied is going to be the predominant color. So I call this the leopard method. I think that's what Woodland Scenics does. Now, the other thing, you can see this hunk of rock mold up here. When I put these rock molds in, I let one harden overnight, and I'll pull it out, and I just put it beside the rocks that I did at the same time. And I'll let the plaster set for at least a week to dry out before I go and color them. If you color them too soon and they're wet, you don't get this nice look in the rock work. And that piece that I kept, that's my test site. So when I run out of stain, I go back to this when I mix it and make sure I've got roughly the same strength in colors. I hope that makes sense. One thing about these paints or pigments is that you can leave them for a week or two, but if you do not seal them with scenic cement, they will fade. This prevents that fading. It locks in the color, and you really have to spray the scenic cement over these paints in order for them to really hold that color. How do I apply all this? I use one of these sponge foam brushes, and see this edge? That is one of the greatest tools for doing this, because you can kind of see this one's kind of washed out. I'll talk about that. Oh, up here a little bit. You can see this crack, and what I did, I put some burnt umber on it. I just followed that crack to highlight it. I think there's some better pictures a little later on. So here I've reinstalled the bridge. I've got some stuff down here. I've painted the river, the basic sand color to start off with, and I've got a little bit of ground foam going on. Here in the bottom of the river, I've taken my airbrush. I painted a little bit of green, and then I painted black to give me the depth. And you can see some rip rock and that underneath the trestle bridge. And then here's on the other side of that river. It's kind of a U-shaped little river. And then I've added some twigs and weeds and, the usual stuff into the river, and then poured Envirotex is the epoxy that I like to use. And there's the scene. Model air equipment. I'm going to go over this real quick. The good, bad, the ugly. You get what you pay for in most cases. A lot of guys will say, "Oh, I got this locomotive for $20." And it usually runs for $20 unless you bought maybe an old Athearn or something. So you have to be careful. Spend some money, get a half-decent engine. You will be so happy about it. I usually say to people starting off, use diesel locomotives compared to steam. They're a lot more forgivable. You don't need as much area either. Short 40-foot cars means more cars than a train. So if you're doing an older style railroad, you're going to get more cars than a train. It looks longer. The new modern cars, you also have to include larger tunnel openings, larger space between that mountain and the track, and make sure you go larger turnouts. And as I said, all cars should meet the NMRA weight standards. Go to the NMRA pages. You'll see the weights for cars. No local car is really ready to run. Check your gauges for the wheels on all your cars, your coupler heights, etc. We'll talk about structures just real briefly. Plastic kits, Walthers is a great source. Laser wood kits, Bar Mills is one of my favorites. New guy on the thing is Mind Mountain Models. He's a great guy, Ron Kleiss. Born and Bard, Sybil Crossing. Plaster kits. I love plaster kits. Downtown Deco. DPM Woodland Scenics are design preservation models. I put them under resin kits because they're not really a plastic, and they're not really a true resin either, but I'll put them there. Kit bashing, you do it from your scrap box. And for scratch building, you usually want to go to some half-decent wood, and I love Mount Albert scale lumber. DPM. If you're going to build one of these, get this forward glue. Miles Hale, who at one time worked for DPM and Woodland Scenics, put me onto this, him and John Lawrence, and this stuff is fantastic for putting these models together. It's the only glue I use for these. It will work for any other plastic, but for these, it is the best. This is a little plaster kit that I did. This is an N scale little one. This is laser cut. This is an S scale. And the nice thing about the laser, they even put in all the nail holes and everything for you. You just really have to finish them. You know, plastic models, simple things. Painting your plastic models. It's one of my pet peeves. You go to a house and you see this Atlas interlocking tower, which everybody's got, and nobody paints it. Just paint them. You don't have to do a lot. You know, the acrylic paints you can buy at Michael's in the little bottles, they work fantastic. Board on board, a little bit of a type of construction that we use, same as a real building process. Here's a little kit from Civil Crossing. It's kind of a board on board kit. It's really a neat little one, and it comes in all scales. And that's it. So I'm going to unshare. And Jordan, I think you can ask questions, I think.
We do have a couple questions. One of the first ones is that, so somebody asked earlier in this stream about grades. If you should create a grade that would require a second engine, or if you should plan for the first, so that you need one locomotive. Sorry, let me rephrase the question.
No, I think I know where you're going. Okay, so they want to know if I plan a grade and I say, well, I need to double head on this grade all the time. I think that becomes a bit of a operations issue. I think you want to build a grade that one locomotive will take it over all the time. You know, you can certainly double head for the effect, but I think, yeah.
Clark, can you? There we go.
Yep, sorry.
You're fine. So one of our other questions is, basically it wasn't a question, but it was talking about hydrocal and checking out pottery supply outfits for stuff you're looking for.
Sure. There's a lot of building supply places here in Ontario, in southern Ontario, in the Toronto area. There's a place called Webster Building Supply. The first time I went in there, another fellow told me about it, and I walked in, and the guy kind of looked at me, and he says, "What do you need, sir?" I said, "Well, I'm looking for white hydrocal." He says, "Oh, you're a model railroader, are you?" He says, "Yeah, I got them in 50-pound bags." So, yeah, any place you can get building supply, usually you can, I think the smallest you can buy is around 50 pounds. But you, like for that one scene you saw with the big bridge, both sides of that and all that rock work, I think I used 600 pounds.
All right. So we're coming up to the end of your segment, and what we would like, Clark, if you'd be willing to, is in our chat, could we have you do a Q&A session in there?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And
awesome.
I'll try and get back to it. And yeah, people can ask me a question, and if I don't have the right answer right at the moment, I can certainly give them my email address, and they can contact me or contact me through Facebook at Clark Kooning. So I hope it wasn't too boring. It's not.
I actually learned some stuff.
It's not like Ralph Renzetti, where he's showing and everybody goes, "Ooh, it's painting." It's kind of a dry topic, especially in track planning and so forth. But I encourage, if you're really interested in track planning, join the Layout Design Guys. It's a special interest group of the NMRA. Join the NMRA. Get out and participate. You're really going to learn some stuff, and you'll have some fun. So we'll see everybody in the chat.
All right. And for me, guys, it's time for me to bid goodnight. We However, the show is just beginning. Up next, taking over the moderator chair is Gert Speed Miller, and the next clinician is Joseph Guinto.